the New South Wales Council of Social Services, NCOSS, partnered with Work Ventures to conduct in-depth cybersecurity assessments of 14 New South Wales social service organisations. NADA was among several peak bodies that nominated its members on a first-come, first-served basis. The project aimed to provide participating organisations with a detailed report on their cybersecurity risks, along with recommendations to mitigate them. Build an evidence base to better understand and quantify cybersecurity risks in the sector, and develop an anonymised sector report to inform the New South Wales Government about the risks faced by service providers, the potential impact on service users, and the level of investment needed to strengthen cybersecurity protections. Founded in 1979, Work Ventures is Australia's first not-for-profit IT social enterprise dedicated to improving technology access, digital skills and cyber safety for not-for-profits and the communities that they serve. To date, they have supported hundreds of not-for-profits and over 90,000 individuals nationwide. Since launching its cybersecurity stream in 2021 with support from the Australian Government, Work Ventures has been working to strengthen cybersecurity across the not-for-profit sector. Today, we have Work Ventures here, and they will help demystify cybersecurity. They'll share key insights from this project and provide practical strategies to help your organisation mitigate key risks. So we'll start with Gabe. He's the cybersecurity lead at Work Ventures. Prior to that, he's held numerous senior cybersecurity roles at multinationals, including Deloitte and Thales. He has a proven track record of implementing and maintaining a range of cybersecurity frameworks for small and mid-sized businesses, as well as to multinational organisations. He excels in translating complex technical concepts into clear, actionable insights for senior executives and non-technical stakeholders like myself. So I'm very, very excited about that because I am useless when it comes to anything tech. And that allows us all to have informed decision-making and strategic alignment with our organisational goals. So I'll stop talking and I'll hand over to Gabe. Thanks, Gabe.
Thanks very much, Michelle, and good morning, everyone. It's great to have you all on the call today. As Michelle mentioned, we've undertaken this project with NCOSS, looking at cybersecurity across the social services sector in New South Wales. And we'd really like today just to share with you some of the outcomes from that project. Hopefully there's some takeaways for you. I'll share some of the key outcomes. I'll also share a link to the full report, but just draw out some of the key findings and takeaways for all of you. So here's what we'll cover today. So I'll intro you to the project, a bit about who was involved, what it covered, how we sort of measured success. I'll jump into the key findings. So I'm going to draw 3 key findings out of the report. As Michelle mentioned, there's a lot of recommendations to both the sector, but also to government. So we've used the advocacy report to do that, advocate to government, to essentially get more funding into this sector, because essentially there is not enough of that happening. There is not enough direct cybersecurity funding in the sector. So that's one key outcome from that project. But another is really just to raise awareness amongst NFPs of some really simple controls that can be put in place to mitigate a lot of risk. And that's really why we're here today, is to share those outcomes or those tips with you, so that hopefully you can go back, have a discussion internally within your own organizations, talk to your IT provider, and get some things put in place. I'll cover a bit about the threat landscape. So what are the specific attacks we're seeing targeting the NFP sector specifically? Looking at some of the higher profile breaches that have happened, and then I'll sort of go right into the details of a smaller community services organisation and a breach that occurred within the parameters of this project. Walk you through what happened from the attacker's perspective, as well as from the organisation's perspective. And then I'll share with you one, or actually a few key tips to actually mitigate or to prevent that risk from happening altogether. Share a basics checklist. So this is not this is not everything that you need to cover from a cybersecurity perspective, but it's a list of basics that you can look to put in place to reduce the likelihood of something happening. And we'll get some insights from a peer organisation that took part in the program, just to show you how they utilised the report and then drove that drove some key outcomes using that report. And if you've got any questions, pop that in the Q&A section. I'll try my best to address those at the end. So just to introduce the project in a little more detail, so we worked with NCOSS a little over a year ago to assess the cybersecurity of 14 organizations who had total revenue between $2 and $20 million per annum, headcounts ranging from 10 to 100 full-time employees. So there's quite a broad sector or a broad range within that sector that we looked to assess. That was by design. We didn't want to just look at larger organizations. We wanted to look at relatively smaller organizations and compare whether there was any, or look at whether there's any trend related to things like revenue and things like headcount. We also measured success based on a maturity score, which was out of 100 total points. And we considered a score of 80 to be mature. Jumping now into some of the key findings. So the first is that cyber maturity is concerningly low across the sector. So none of the organizations met the benchmark for cyber maturity or a score of 80 out of 100. Despite that, all organizations recognize the importance of cyber, but just reported that they didn't have the resources to actually respond effectively. And this is consistent with not just this project, but what we've seen much broader in working with the NFP sector. Smaller organizations also demonstrated the lowest levels of maturity. So you can see in that graph there, there's a really tight relationship between gross income, which is mapped across that horizontal axis, and the cybersecurity score, which is mapped on that vertical. So we can see that smaller organizations did have a much weaker cybersecurity posture. We've got that red box, which basically indicates the highest risk organizations. That's essentially those who, it's really not a case of if something was going to happen, but when something is going to happen from a cybersecurity perspective. So one of these organizations actually incurred a data breach within 2 weeks of us initially engaging them. They received our recommendations and basically just reported back and said, look, we understand the recommendations. It was really clear, but we just don't have the time or the resources to dedicate into implementing them. And so, again, I'll break that down for you, what happened and how you guys can prevent that from happening to your own organization. Second key finding here is that there's an excessive and often misplaced reliance on external parties. So often organizations are transferring risk. Most of the time that's into cyber insurance. So when we asked the focus group, we noticed that 93% of organizations had a cyber insurance policy. And that's compared to 20% of Australian small and medium enterprises of a similar profile. Which is not necessarily a negative. It's great to have insurance in place. But what we saw was that rather than actually reducing the likelihood or actually mitigating these risks internally, the focus group were instead relying on their insurance to cover them if something did happen, which holds up in some cases where they may be provided with some sort of financial benefit through the insurance. But in many cases, we see that that doesn't fully cover them from a financial perspective. It also doesn't cover them from a reputational perspective in many cases. So we see with data breaches and cybersecurity incidents, it quite often results in a loss of trust from donors and funders. It also has a direct impact on the people you serve. So especially when we look at this NCOSS project, the organizations we assessed were servicing some of the most vulnerable communities within New South Wales. And so to further disadvantage them by making their data, or exposing their data to threat actors, it puts them at further disadvantage and also exposes them to things like identity theft and also more specific or target attacks. I've also got some polls that I don't just want to talk at you guys for an hour. I want to hear back from the audience. So I've got some polls. It'd be great to get some audience participation. Johannes, are you able to share the first one with me, please? So the first poll is, have you conducted an independent cyber assessment in the past 12 months? Relatively even split. Well done for those who have. I think when we talk about cybersecurity and look at implementing a program, the starting point is always a cybersecurity assessment, which essentially provides you with the key risks within your organization and a roadmap to know what to prioritize. This is particularly important because there are so many things that you need to look into from a cybersecurity perspective. Knowing where to start really begins with that initial cyber assessment. So well done to those who have. Moving on, I might just do one more poll and then move through to the next key finding from the report. Do you outsource your IT infrastructure management to an external party, or external provider rather? Yeah, so 100% are saying yes. This is consistent with what we saw within the NCOSS project. So we saw that 13 of the 14 organizations actually outsource their IT infrastructure management to a managed service provider. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're at higher risk than those who manage it internally. It just means that you need to put a little bit more emphasis on understanding or conducting due diligence against that service provider to understand how your environment's been set up, whether the right security controls have been put in place to effectively protect your data. And that's another thing that sort of we've emphasized within the report is that we saw a lot of misconfigured environments, which opened a lot of these organizations up to undue risk and threat actors. The last party that these organizations were sort of overly reliant on were software vendors. So we saw a trend within the NFP sector was that organizations are migrating to cloud-based services. So they're moving away from on-premise networks into cloud-based environments, which means that their data is being stored by software or within software vendor systems. That means that we need to be conducting the right due diligence over those software vendors to ensure that they're actually putting the right controls and processes in place to make sure that bad actors can't get to that data. And a key example, and we were talking about it before, everyone joined with Michelle, but the Qantas breach is a key example of that, where a third party is storing Qantas's data or their customers' data, and there's been a flaw in that process and system that has led to the unauthorized access to data. And you can see the impact that that's had on Qantas as an organization. There are many other examples of sort of supply chain attacks where attackers are focusing on software vendors, essentially because it's a much juicier target for an attacker. Rather than going after one organization's data, they can actually target a software vendor and potentially gain access to hundreds of organizations' data. The next key finding is that most organizations have not addressed the basics, let alone more complex controls. So 70% have not conducted any due diligence on their supply chain. 93% do not have controls in place to limit what software can be installed on their devices. Now, this is really important when it comes to things like malware. Attackers will often target users through email, trying to get them to click on an attachment and install a piece of software. That is a key control to prevent that, is to limit who can install and execute software on their machine. That should ideally be locked down to IT admins, and then anyone else has to sort of go through the IT provider or the IT admin rather to install that piece of software. 21% have not disabled administrative privileges on standard user accounts. Now, the administrative privileges essentially allow a user to execute certain configurations on the laptop whether that's from a security perspective or things like installing and executing software. Again, this needs to be locked down to only the IT admins. We see far too often people who don't require those privileges are provided them. And it's essentially just increasing your attack exposure. So an attacker has far more or a lot more targets to go after within an organization through things like phishing, and then try and gain access to those accounts. If they gain access to a privileged account, they can do far more on that account and far more damage. So it's really important to lock those down to only who absolutely needs them. The last point here is that 65% have not implemented any form of employee cyber awareness and training. So just as our employees are a most important asset from an operational perspective, they're also really important from a security perspective too. More than 90% of attacks these days result from targeting a human as opposed to a system. Again, same thing with the Qantas breach. The attacker targeted a human going through their call center, masquerading themselves as a legitimate user of that system, and then gained access to the data through socially engineering themselves in rather than exploiting a vulnerability in a system. They've tried to exploit or trick a person into giving them access when they shouldn't have. So it's really important to be providing training to your staff to ensure they understand what are the red flags in a dodgy email that I've received. Can they find those red flags and identify that it's malicious? And then once they've done that, do they know what to do next? So really, really critical. So we also looked at the threat landscape, and I guess what I mean by that is, what are the attacks that are being targeted against NFPs? What are the specific attacks that we're seeing? So we boiled it down to 4 main key threat groups. And this is sort of mapped across government threat intelligence data and other reports that are being published in a similar space as well. And these are quite consistent across all of those different reports. The first is compromised account or credentials is perhaps one of the most prevalent. So this is where you may have had your username and password details breached as a result of using a third-party service that has been involved in a security incident. Oftentimes, attackers will do a mass export of passwords and then sell those passwords on the dark web. And you'd be surprised at how cheaply you can actually pick up thousands of passwords on the dark web. And then attackers have really just recycled those passwords and using them to try and gain access to different systems. Another way they can do this is sending you emails, trying to trick you into thinking that perhaps they are Microsoft, and they send you to a Microsoft login page, which is in fact a malicious site. Once you input your username and password details, rather than being logged into Microsoft, it's actually sending those details directly to the attacker. The second point here is around business email compromise. And this is where an attacker will masquerade themselves as a legitimate supplier and say to you that, oh, look, we've changed our BSB and account number. Please deposit your monthly funds into this new account. When I say it like that, a lot of people will think that, there's probably not a lot of people that are falling for that, but millions of Australian dollars have been lost as part of that compromise alone this year. And so it's really, really critical to be validating it. If any of your suppliers are changing their account details, first thing you need to do is validate whether that's the case over the phone with your supplier. Don't go through email. Oftentimes the attacker has compromised the supplier's email address, and so they will basically be able to validate on their behalf. So always important just to go through a separate means, often a phone call, and validate that that's legitimate. The next one here is ransomware, which talks to attackers trying to lock the files on your local machine by sending you, typically it's an email, trying to get you to click on an attachment, and then that attachment will essentially prompt you to install a piece of software on your device. Once installed, it will lock or encrypt all of the files on your laptop. The sort of ransom part of that ransomware name is that they will then request a ransom to be paid, typically in an untraceable cryptocurrency, in exchange for the return of your data. So in this case, it's really, really important to have a restorable backup of your data. So if you're taking regular backups of your data, in the case of a ransomware incident, you can remove the ransomware from the device and then restore your backup or restore your data from that last backup. Of course, you will have lost the data from between when the last backup was taken and when the ransomware event happened, but it's much better than losing everything. And we see ransomware events happening every day to major organizations, to small NFPs. This is one of the most prevalent threats that we're seeing at the moment. The last one here is supply chain attacks. And this is what I was talking about before in terms of software vendors. So we know that NFPs are migrating to cloud-based services. Attackers also know that NFPs are migrating to cloud-based services. And so they will go after software vendors and they will look for vulnerabilities to try and exploit and gain access to those software vendors' environments. And rather than gaining access to, say, one organization's data, they can gain access to many just through exploiting one particular vulnerability. So I've shared a few NFP sort of adjacent attacks that have happened in the past few years. Many of you would have seen these on the news. So Pareto Phone, which is a telemarketer which held the data of tens of thousands of Australian donors. Excuse me. They actually collapsed as a result of that data breach directly. Similar case for MediSecure, who held millions and millions of Australians' personal health information, suffered a data breach, and there was very significant outcome for them. St. Vincent's Health, similar types of data, personal health information. And then the last one there just sort of shows you the volume of data that hackers are sometimes able to gain access to. An estimated 215 gigabytes of data in this case, and nearly 420,000 files taken and likely published on the dark web. So you can imagine the impact that some of these breaches have had, obviously on the organizations for those who have gone insolvent as a result of the data breach, but more so that the people they serve. The amount of personal health and sensitive personal information that was stored in some of those databases very likely could have opened those people up to identity theft. I might just launch the next poll, please, Johannes, just to hear from our audience.
Just loading. Sec.
So how is your IT network and systems environment hosted? Do you have an on-premises network where you have servers located in the office? Do you have a cloud-based, where you use cloud-based services, or is it kind of a mixture of both? Yeah, most people are either fully cloud or hybrid. And I think, again, it's consistent with what we saw with NCOSS. A lot of NFPs are moving onto cloud-based systems. It sort of reinforces the need to conduct the right due diligence. And what I mean by due diligence is really asking questions of the vendor around their security, asking them whether they adhere to certain industry standards and frameworks, looking at their policies and procedural documents, things like asking them whether they've had any security incidents in the past, or looking at network diagrams and those sort of things. There's sort of technical components to that, but there's things you can do from a non-technical perspective to also gain a bit of assurance there as well. I mean, the ideal time to do that due diligence is really before you engage the vendor or before you sign a contract with the vendor. That's sort of the time that you have the most leverage to get things actioned or to actually get that information in the first place. So thanks everyone for taking part in that poll. Moving through now. So, and I mean, it's not just the higher profile ones that you see on the news. There are many, many hundreds of organizations, and right down to small social services organizations that have experienced data breaches. One of them was last year during the NCOSS project, we had one of our participants, or one of the participating organizations, actually incurred a data breach. I'll now share with you sort of what happened and then a bit about what you can do to actually mitigate this in the future. So the attacker has impersonated a legitimate contact to the employee by sending them an email containing a link to a fake Microsoft login page. The user has clicked on that link and entered their username and password. The attacker has used those credentials to access the organization's Microsoft environment. That has given the attacker access to things like SharePoint and OneDrive, which contain sensitive personal information of their clients. It's also given the attacker access to the entire mailbox contact list within Outlook, which the attacker has then used to recycle that specific email and then target many other thousands of individuals. So the one control that would have absolutely prevented that is multi-factor authentication, which is essentially you have a username and password to access a system. Multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication is essentially where you have a separate one-time password or PIN code that's sent to typically an application on your phone. That control alone would have prevented this attack from happening. So I think if there's one thing to take away from this webinar today, go back, have an internal discussion, understand whether you have multi-factor authentication enabled on all of your systems that store and process really critical information. And then if you need to sort of reach out to your IT provider and do the same, that's probably one of the key takeaways from today. And there's much more than that though. So another important thing to do is to assess, well, the very starting point is to assess your cyber risks. And we recommend to do this annually because of the very rapid pace of change within cybersecurity and also technology. So we're seeing the use of AI really pick up. That, of course, has an impact on our cybersecurity landscape. We're seeing attackers change their techniques and targets. And so it's really critical to stay on top of these developments. Do you enforce strong passwords and, as we mentioned, multi-factor authentication for all systems? Do you patch all applications and operating systems? So when we talk about patches, software vendors will often release these to both patch bugs in the system, but also security vulnerabilities that have been reported. So if you're not patching those systems actively, that means there are vulnerabilities that are remaining in those systems that can then be exploited by threat actors. Do you encrypt sensitive data that is exposed to the internet? When we talk about encryption, that is essentially the process of translating data in plain text or something that can be read, and then applying an encryption algorithm and changing that data into something that cannot be read by anyone who doesn't have that encryption key. And that's really important for anything that is exposed to the internet, because it means if you have an encrypted system, it reduces the likelihood of an attacker being able to access that data unauthorized. Have you restricted IT administrative privileges? So we spoke a little bit about that before, but essentially the IT administrative privileges are like giving the keys to the kingdom to a user on your laptop or your network. So that should be absolutely limited to only those who absolutely need it. Have you restricted the installation and execution of unapproved software? So if we have a defined list of approved software, then anything outside of that should be blocked. So that will significantly reduce the risk of things like malware and ransomware, because if that ransomware is not on the approved list of software, the user cannot install or execute it. Are your staff trained to identify phishing emails? So again, a lot of these attack vectors are through phishing emails, suspicious emails trying to get you to click on a link or install a piece of software or enter username and password details. Really important to ensure that your staff are able to identify red flags in suspicious emails. Do you back up all critical data? And has that actually been tested? So we speak with a lot of organizations who have a backup policy, but they haven't actually tested the restoration capability. So in the case of a ransomware event, if you haven't tested that backup, you're essentially rolling the dice as to whether you can recover that data. Conducting due diligence on third-party vendors, we cover that one. And then lastly, do you have a process in place to log and monitor endpoint devices, which is essentially laptops and servers, and also network infrastructure? So this is about understanding or identifying whether something bad has happened within your network. So the point I want to make is that we can put all of these other things in place, but we can never reduce the likelihood of a cybersecurity incident down to zero. So if something goes wrong, we need to know about that as quickly as possible. The quicker we can respond to a cybersecurity incident, the less impact that will have on the organization. Before I jump into the next slide, I might just launch the last poll and hear from you guys on this last one. So do you think there is a benefit of an independent cybersecurity assessment in the next 6 months? Good to see most have said yes. I'm hoping the one who said no has already done one in the last 6 months or 12 months. So thanks everyone for responding to that. Hoping now to share with you some insights from a peer organization who took part in this project. So she isn't actually here today, but what we've done is we've got a recording of one of our last webinars, just to show you some of the outcomes that were driven through her as a result of the findings report.
Perhaps if you just introduce yourself firstly, Ari, and then we'll go through a few. Questions about your experience in the project.
Sure thing, Anthony, not a problem. I was the Executive Director of Corporate Services at the Buttery during the time of the Work Ventures review. It was quite an interesting process. Just to give you a bit of an idea about the size of our organisation, which will really help, I think, people on this call to understand. Basically, the Buttery is around about a $15 million a year organisation. We have about 120 staff spread out from the Queensland border to around about sort of Port Macquarie, a little bit further south. So not a massive nor highly sophisticated major not-for-profit organisation, relatively small in the big scheme of things. We only have 2 internal IT people. Neither of those IT workers were comprehensively trained in IT, so we didn't really have any internal capacity, and relied very much on our IT managed service provider to do most of our cybersecurity for us, like most of the participants of this particular assessment. So the Buttery basically approached this with a very open mind, and we participated wholeheartedly in the review. So I wanted to make myself available to explain to other organisations the process that we went through and the things that we got out of it, to try and hopefully inspire others to understand that it is not an insurmountable obstacle, that improving your cyber posture can be done. And I hope that by sharing our experiences, you can get something out of it.
Thanks, Sari. So before embarking on the project, how much emphasis or priority would you say that the Buttery placed on cybersecurity?
I think like most of the organisations that are watching this webinar, the board is obviously very wants to ensure that cybersecurity is taken care of. And we also knew that it was important. I guess from our perspective, we just didn't know what that actually meant and where we should start on our improvement process. We knew that there was work to be done, but couldn't quite put our finger on exactly what needed to be done.
And having gone through, the cyber assessment process, what would you say are some of the most valuable takeaways that came out of it?
Hands down, the most valuable thing that happened for our organisation after the assessment is the fact that you get at the end, one of the tangible deliverables that Work Ventures will give you is 2 things. They give you a written report And in that written report, they give you actual action items. Ari, at the Buttery, if you want to improve your cyber posture, you need to do this, then this, then this. We recommend it in this order. But not only do they give you this written report, they'll actually sit down with you and they'll have a session with their team and with Gabe and yourself and your team, so that if you don't understand something or you want to flesh out an idea, you can actually interactively ask questions. One of the things I really liked about the report and the feedback session was that Gabe delivered it in really plain English. I am not an IT technical person. I don't understand a lot of the jargon and the terms that are used. And Gabe basically spoke to me in plain English in a way that I could really understand. That didn't make me feel like an idiot as well. So what I really appreciated from that was when I left that session, I was actually able to take that action plan and turn it into my own action plan. And I was able to even undertake a couple of those things that were suggested very, very quickly. I got some real tangible benefits very immediately, which our board was really impressed with, not long after having that feedback session. So that was probably the big takeaway for us, was this it laid out the path. Before we had this session, we knew we needed to do something, but we couldn't put our finger on what it was. After we had the Work Ventures review, we had this very clear pathway laid out in front of us with phased ideas and step-by-step instructions, and we felt really supported by Work Ventures in that.
So for any organisations that might be here today who might be unsure about what to do next or what to do about their cybersecurity, what sort of advice would you give them based on your experience?
For me, it felt insurmountable at one point. Before we started this process, I really could not put my finger on where to start. So my first advice is, you need to start, do something. And the best way to start is to get somebody else to tell you where your vulnerabilities are, or some quick fix action items that you can do very, very quickly to immediately get some real benefits from. So to put it in perspective, before we did the Work Ventures review, I was responsible for cybersecurity, and I was using my annual insurance cybersecurity return, which I'm sure we all love doing every year, to sort of measure myself against, how we're performing. Am I doing these things that my insurer are looking for? That really is just the tip of the iceberg. And by doing the review with Work Ventures, you will get some very clear understanding and explanation of all the rest of it that underpins getting you to that point where your insurer wants you to be to make you less of a risk. So it's the how-to that's really, really helpful. And that's why I would really recommend this particular process. The second is, don't be afraid to ask for help. I am one person in a relatively small organisation. I formed a working group with only 2 other people. One was our QA coordinator and the other was our internal IT business and analyst. So he was responsible for managing our CMS. And together we just did really straightforward things with the help of Work Ventures. We did things like we sent out a survey to our staff to ask them, what are the things that are working for you, what's not working? And then we gradually worked through and were able to prioritise some digital ideas that we wanted to work on. From there, we realised that there was probably much more work that needed to be done. And eventually, months later, we ended up with a full digital transformation strategy. So I'd like to sort of point out, we never intended to do a full DTS. We just intended to try and uplift our cybersecurity. But once we started the process, we realised how capable we actually were, because we don't have to be technical experts. That's what you've got Work Ventures and other partners out there to help you with. It was more, I know our business better than anybody. I know what needs to be done. And then you lean into those technical partners to help you get to where you need to be.
Excellent. Thank you, Ari. Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, because I think it can be quite overwhelming for organisations where there's so much going on, or that they have to be across on a day-to-day running an organisation, and IT and cybersecurity can be a bit daunting. And so to having somebody who has that expertise to sort of come in and give that advice and in plain language and some steps, practical steps to work through, makes a difference. So yeah, thanks for sharing. Perhaps if
So hopefully you can all see through Ari's experience that you don't necessarily need to have a huge organization to undertake a cybersecurity project, or you can really have a lasting impact through just driving change through one person in the organization and relying on some partners who can provide you with that technical detail. I've now sort of shared some of our services. If we can at all help you with any of these areas, so really what we do is cyber risk assessment and audit services. We also look at things like advisory and strategy, as well as a number of other technical areas that you can see there. If there's anything that you're sort of looking at here and saying that we need a bit of help in this area, please feel free to reach out. I've included Johannes's contact there, just if you want to scan that QR code and sort of go through. If you're not really sure if you want to go through with anything, or you just kind of want to understand where you're at, maybe what's the best next step, please, again, feel free to reach out for an obligation-free chat. We're more than happy to help you. I've also shared a link to the full report there if you want to scan that QR code and sort of go through that report at your own pace. I'm happy to open up the Q&A if we have any questions. Johannes, I'm not sure if there are any in the chat currently.
Yes, actually, there was one question by Marcus earlier. What do you consider to be an independent cyber assessment?
Yeah, so really the independence comes from getting an external party in to conduct that assessment and I guess the role of, or the reason behind that is to reduce or remove any bias from the process. We're seeing a lot of IT managed service providers actually offering cybersecurity assessments against their own environments. And so there is obviously a level of bias there. We want to come in, understand without any, of our own interests at mind, understand exactly where the vulnerabilities are and what we can do to actually remediate those. So that's really the goal of the independent part of that assessment, is to remove sort of any bias from the process.
Thanks, Gabe. Any other questions? Feel free to drop it in the chat or just turn on your mic and ask away.
I can see Marcus says, external data held on CRMs like Salesforce, is it sufficient to accept that they are secure? And that controls as to how we allow users to log on is what we focus on. Yeah, look, I think it's not, I wouldn't accept what any software vendor is just doing. I would definitely undertake that due diligence, not just from an access perspective. Understand things like whether they're encrypting that data within the database, whether they have the right capability, if an incident does occur, to respond effectively to that incident. Looking at, access is important as well. So looking at how Salesforce administer access, whether that's sufficient for your own environment, can you do anything else to actually use your own organization's access management controls to access Salesforce rather than just relying on Salesforce itself? So there's a lot of things that you can look at from, vendors like Salesforce, particularly, CRMs, which have a lot of configurable settings. Even things like the session timeout. So how long after a session is idle for does the web application actually kick me off that system? Things like that are usually configurable and will have an impact on the security. So the longer you leave that session open for, the greater the window is for an attacker to potentially gain remote access to your session by stealing like a session cookie. There's a number of other things that I would sort of say you need to look into, but sort of definitely on the right track with what you're saying in terms of looking at the access there, Marcus. Hopefully that's answered the question.
Thank you, Gabe. Well, we kind of hear earlier about how, Ari find the cyber assessment quite useful from her perspective. We kind of like, why don't we double click a little bit on kind of what that process looks like and anything you might need to know. I might hand that to Head of Client Solutions, Mil, to maybe kind of elaborate a little bit on that.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everyone. My name is Mil. I'm the Head of Client Solutions at Work Ventures. Very good question. I mean, what does value look like? Or what is the cost? What is the budget for all these assessments? At the end of the day, I mean, all of you are representing organizations that are in the sector. So we've seen cybersecurity assessments range from free to over 30,000, often delivering inconsistent value for not-for-profits. So Work Ventures, we are a not-for-profit ourselves. So with that insight, we've kind of designed this cost-effective, high-impact cybersecurity assessment tailored to the sector. So typically, it's priced at $7,500. So this is a holistic assessment, which goes beyond technical checks to provide a clear understanding of your organization's vulnerabilities. They provide you with actionable recommendations and capability building support. The final report, this is the critical thing. So what happens through the workshop to our analysis and our presentations, that's the process. However, the final report, which is in plain English, as I think Ari mentioned as well, includes a strategic roadmap to strengthen your cyber resilience over the next 1 to 2 years, depending on where each of your organizations are and your budget constraints. So one thing I want to leave with you is by attending today's webinar, you are entitled to our risk assessment. Just as I've mentioned it, and just as Gabe's spoken about it, it's just for $5,000. So that's thanks to ACTCOSS. We are collaborating on this webinar today. So we're happy to provide that at $5,000 ex-GST. If you have any questions around the assessment, how to start and so forth, feel free to just pop it in the chat or just ask any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mil. And I'm sure Gabe saw this question as well from Phil Miller. What are the key factors that organizations should consider when determining the appropriate level of cyber insurance coverage?
Yeah, this is a great question, and it comes down to the inherent risk of your organization. So look at the services that your organization provides. What are the types of people that you service? What are the types of data from those individuals are you collecting? Is that are you collecting a lot of personally identifiable information? Are you collecting personal health information? If you are inherently a higher risk organization and you're providing those services that mean you have to collect that data, then inherently you need to look at a higher level of coverage. And specifically, you need to look at things like, do you have incident response capabilities provided to you in the case that something happens? Will your insurer provide you with access to someone who can look forensically at the computer or the server and understand what's happened and actually remediate that? Or what's the sort of extent to which that cyber insurance is providing you services? So we see often there's two kind of categories when it comes to insurance. The first is the insurer will provide you with a certain payout. Secondly, they'll provide you with a series of services that could be, like I said, from a technical perspective to actually help you recover and actually contain that incident. It could be things like access to legal services and also things like access to services that allow you to easily communicate to your stakeholders what's gone wrong and actually what you're doing about that. So hopefully that sort of helps to answer the question. Any other questions?
Any more questions? And yeah, there's a evaluation from Michelle. Everyone would be great to fill that in. If there's nothing else on my hand, back to Michelle then.
Yeah, thank you so much for presenting today on that. And we also appreciate you providing our ACTCOSS members a substantial discount on your services. So thank you very much for that. I learned a lot, in particular about I really appreciate the cybersecurity's basic checklist. And I think one of the key takeaways that I got, but there was a lot of information there that, thank you, it was a simple language for me, and not high tech, is that just reinforcing that with staff, if they do something wrong, just let us know. Let us know so we can fix it. And I think that was something that was really, really quite good. We do have some extra training coming up, not in this space, but for some free webinars. So we've got understanding the budget process in August, and in September we will be hosting the requirements for working with vulnerable people cards for community organisations. Before we leave, I've just popped that into the comments, so please feel free to go in and register. We have got a question for you guys at Work Ventures. It's saying, is $5,000 covered all your services for non-profit? So I guess they're just wanting some clarity about what that $5,000 will cover.
Happy to take that.
No?
Yeah, so the 5,000 is that holistic cyber security risk assessment. So it's pretty much the end-to-end. So from the workshops to the analysis to providing you with a report, a detailed report that is, the blueprint pretty much for your uplift program, to actually going through that report with you. So Gabe and team will pretty much do that end-to-end for $5,000.
So my understanding also was that you were happy for people to get in touch with you just for an obligation-free, just have a chat, see what your organisation might need, and then they can give you a bit more information about what services they could do for you. So yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to come and talk in front of your members. Thanks everyone for joining today. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Don't forget
Thanks all.
to fill in the evaluation form. It helps us with our info sessions. Thank you, Mills and Johannes and Gabe. Greatly appreciated.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks all.